Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Bets are off, I'm gonna find my way tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
Okay, hello. It is time to jump into another couple of chapters from the Temple and the Lodge. We are on chapters 14 and 15 this time, which actually finishes out the third section and starts us into the fourth and final section of the book. There are 19 chapters total, so we're getting quite a ways into it and on the downhill slide of it. There's also an interlude, but it's only like a couple of pages. So we'll tack it onto the end. And a postscript, a couple pages. But anyway, 19 chapters. It is dry reading, I understand, and but that's history. If you came here to listen to me read history, it's going to be kind of dry reading. There's nothing, nothing else for it. It's history. All right, so chapter 14, Freemasons and Knights Templar. Despite papal injunctions, Jacobite Freemasonry pursued its own course, still steadfastly aligned to the Stuart cause and the dream of restoring the Stuarts to the British throne. More explicitly than ever before, the Jacobites began to use Freemasonry and the proliferating network of lodges on the continent, first for recruitment and then, after their defeat, for support of distressed exiled brethren. In 1746, for example, an English Jacobite arrived in France bearing letters which urged all Freemasons to come to his aid. But if the Jacobites thus exploited Freemasonry for political purposes, they also publicly reintegrated it with elements of its own origins and heritage, elements which had been winnowed out by Grand Lodge. Influenced by Fenelon, Ramsay reinvested Jacobite Freemasonry with a mystical character. More important, he reintroduced in his oration a specifically chivalric dimension, stressing the role of the Crusaders. Later, he was to speak of the endeavor to reinstate the Stuarts as nothing less than a crusade. In letters exchanged between lodges at this time, there was much talk of innovations introduced which aimed at transforming the fraternity from an ordre de society, it's in French, whatever, to an ordre de chevalier. It's not chevalier, it's chevalerie. Chevalerie. Uh, Order of chivalry. Pamphlets and even police reports begin to speak of the new chevaliers and this order of chivalry. In Grand Lodge, if Grand Lodge was evolving into a social adhesive, Jacobite Freemasonry aspired to something markedly more dramatic, more romantic, more grandiose. A new generation of mystical knights and warriors charged with the exalted mission of reclaiming a kingdom and restoring a sacred bloodline to its throne. The parallels to the Templars were too obvious to be ignored, and it was only a matter of time before they were invoked explicitly as precursors of Freemasonry. It is not clear precisely when, within the privacy of lodges whose records, if they ever existed, have long been lost, the connections between Freemasonry and the Templars were first made explicit. Very likely it was as early as 1689 when David Claverhouse arrived in France allegedly with the Templar cross recovered from his brother's body and passed it on to the Abbé Calmet. But while one can only speculate about this, there is no question that by the 1730s, under the auspices of Radcliffe and Ramsay, the Templar heritage was being promulgated. In 1738, shortly after Ramsay's oration, the Marquis d'Argens published an article on Freemasonry. In this work, he speaks of Jacobite lodges attempting to arrogate a specifically Templar pedigree to themselves. And during the course of the next decade, the Templars, so far at least as all forms of Freemasonry other than Grand Lodge were concerned, became increasingly the focus of attention. In 1743, for example, the so-called Vengeance or Kadosh degree is believed to have been introduced at Lyon. Vengeance to be exacted by Freemasonry for the death of the last Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. We have already noted how potent this motif was to become. The man chiefly responsible for publicizing the Templar heritage within Freemasonry was a German nobleman, Baron Karl Gottlieb von Hund. Having first joined a lodge in Frankfurt, Hund, very much a man of the world, traveled widely in Freemasonic circles. Between December 1742 and September 1743, he was in Paris. Early in the 1750s, he began to advertise an ostensibly new form of Freemasonry, which claimed quite specifically a Templar origin. When pressed to justify himself, Hund declared that during his 9-month visit to Paris, he had been introduced to Templar Freemasonry. He arrived 6 months before Ramsay's death, 3 years before Radcliffe's. He had, he said, been initiated into higher degrees and dubbed Chevalier Templier by an unknown superior, identified to him only by the appellation of ex Penarubra, Knight of the Red Feather. This ceremony, he declared, had been performed in the presence of, among others, a certain Lord Clifford, probably the young Lord Clifford of Chudleigh, related by marriage to Radcliffe, and the Earl of Kilmarnock. Not long after his induction, Hund said he was presented to Charles Edward Stuart in person, whom he was led to believe was one of the unknown superiors, if not indeed the secret Grand Master of the whole of Freemasonry. Okay, before we go on, we've got a few pages of pictures in this fairly short chapter. It's only like 6 pages. So, we've got 3 on this page. The first being Ruined Church of Temple near Edinburgh, formerly known as Ballantradock, the headquarters of the Order of the Temple in Scotland. So, that would be that one. Okay. The next one, the one on the left, is 17th century grave at temple showing Masonic dividers and set square. Okay. And then I'll go ahead and read the caption for the other one. 17th century grave at temple with skull and crossbones flanked by Masonic tools. So, the inside one here is the one with the dividers and set square, apparently. Hard to see, though. I think they're there up at the top. And then, this one is the skull and bones. Come on. Skull and bones. Hard. Let me get my. Oh. Get that hand up out of the way. Skull and bones. And I can see something off to the side there, but I can't quite make it out. All right. And then we have some swords. So the first two, the above swords, left mid to late 15th century sword, probably of German origin, right mid 17th century blade, 19th century hilt, currently in private collection, Stella Templum Scotorum, have long been in Scottish Jacobite Templar ownership. One of them is known to have been used by the Earl of Kilmarnock and his colleagues to initiate Baron von Hund into the Jacobite Order of the Temple 1743. So that's those two. Come on. There we go. So I'm guessing this inside one is the one with the 17th century blade, 18th century hilt. Or 19th century hilt? Yeah, 19th century hilt, sorry. And then the other one is personal ceremonial sword of Alexander Duchar, master of the Scottish Templars, Militia Templi Scotia, from 1810 to 1835. Duchar gathered a large collection of regalia and documents relating to early Scottish Templarism and Freemasonry. And it's got a skull up here in the pommel and crossed bones for the hilt. And that's which would be femurs, the leg bones, the thigh bones. Okay, and then we've got one more page, and then we get back to reading. English Masonic Knights Templar Star Jewels, circa 1830. A candidate for admission must already be both a Master Mason, exalted in the Royal Arch, and a Christian. It is thus distinguished from the religious freedom allowed by craft Freemasonry as promulgated by United Grand Lodge of England. So that's these. There's one. Focus. And the other one. With the cross and the skull and crossbones and a casket, it looks like, in the back of that one. This one's got the cross. I see the skull. Oh, there are the crossbones right underneath it. Okay. So there you go. All right. The form of Freemasonry to which Hund had been introduced was subsequently to become known under the name of strict observance. Its name derived from the oath it demanded, an oath of unswerving and unquestioning obedience to the mysterious unknown superiors. The basic tenet of the strict observance was that it had descended directly from the Knights Templar. Members of the strict observance felt they were legitimately entitled to refer to themselves as Knights of the Temple. Excuse me. I was fine until I started reading, and now all of a sudden I'm all stuffy. To his own embarrassment, Hund, then, when pressed for further information and evidence, was unable to support his claims. As a consequence, many of his contemporaries dismissed him as a charlatan and accused him of having fabricated the account of his initiation. His meeting with unknown superiors and with Charles Edward Stuart, his mandate to disseminate the strict observance. To these charges, Hund could only reply plaintively that his unknown superiors had abandoned him. They had promised to contact him again, he protested, and to give him further instructions, but had never done so. To the end of his life, he continued to affirm his integrity, maintaining that he had been deserted by his original sponsors. With the wisdom of historical hindsight, it is now clear that Hund was a victim not so much of any deliberate betrayal as of circumstances beyond everyone's control. He had been initiated in 1742, when Jacobite currency was still good, when the Stuarts enjoyed considerable prestige and influence on the continent, when there seemed a reasonable prospect of restoring Charles Edward to the British throne. Within 3 years, however, all that was to change. On 2 August 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie, without the French support originally promised him, landed in Scotland. At a council of war, it was decided by one vote to advance southwards, and the Jacobite forces embarked on a march intended to bring them to London. They entered Manchester and on 4 December reached Derby. But few volunteers rallied to them, a mere 150 men in Manchester, and the spontaneous uprisings they expected on their behalf never occurred. After 2 days in Derby, it became painfully obvious that the only option was retreat. With Hanoverian troops in pursuit, the Jacobites fell back, and their situation during the 4 months that followed continued to deteriorate. At last, on 16 April 1746, they were cornered by the army of the Duke of Cumberland at Culloden, and in less than 30 minutes were virtually annihilated. Charles Edward Stuart fled into ignominious exile again and spent the rest of his life in obscurity. Of the prominent Jacobites who survived the battle, many were deported, banished, or driven into voluntary exile. Some, including the Earl of Kilmarnock, were executed. So too was Charles Radcliffe, captured in a French ship off the Dogger Bank. The Jacobite dream of restoring the Stuarts to the British throne was extinguished forever. Man, why did I get so stuffy always? It is hardly surprising, therefore, that Hund's unknown superiors, who were all prominent Jacobites, never contacted him again. Most of them were dead, in prison, in exile, or laying very low. There was no one of sufficient prestige left to help him vindicate his claims, and he was left to promulgate strict observance Freemasonry on his own. But he certainly does not seem to have been a charlatan, or to have fabricated his account of his induction into Templar Freemasonry. Indeed, there has only recently come to light some telling evidence in his favor. The identity of Hund's hidden master. Part of Hund's evidence concerning the pedigree of strict observance consists of a list of Grand Masters of the original Knights Templar from their inception in 1118 until very recently. There had been numerous such lists, none of which concurred with any of the others, and all of which had been academically suspect. It was not until 1982 that we ourselves were able to produce what can now be regarded as a definitive list of the early Grand Masters until the loss of Jerusalem. This list was compiled with the aid of information and documentation which were not available or accessible in Hund's time, so that he cannot possibly have drawn on the same sources as we did, and yet, except for the spelling of a single surname, he produced a list reputedly received from his unknown superiors, which concurred precisely with our own. Hund's list can only have come from inside sources, from sources who were indeed privy to Templar history and or records in a way that no outsider at the time could have been. A second particularly important piece of evidence in Hund's favor involves the identity of the Knight of the Red Feather, who he claimed had dubbed him a Knight of the Temple in 1742. Until now, the identity of this individual has remained a mystery, and in some quarters he has been regarded as pure fiction. Hund himself, as we have seen, at first thought the Knight of the Red Feather to have been Charles Edward Stuart. Other commentators have suggested the Earl of Kilmarnock, Grand Master of Jacobite Freemasonry in France at the time, but in making this suggestion they have forgotten, or chosen to ignore, Hund's assertion that Kilmarnock was present in the room at the same moment as the pseudonymous individual. That's a weird word I've never seen. We ourselves, in a previous work, suggested that the Knight of the Red Feather might have been Radcliffe, whom Hund did not say was present. Now, however, it is possible to establish almost definitively who the Knight of the Red Feather actually was. In 1987, we obtained access to the papers of a group called Stella Templum, which had, over 200 years or more, maintained an archive of Jacobite Templar material. In it was a letter dated 30 July 1846, 19 days short of the 100th anniversary of the Earl of Kilmarnock's execution at the Tower of London on 18 August 1746. The signature on the letter appears to be that of one H. White, Whyte, and beneath it there is a wax seal in the form of a Templar cross. The addressee is simply called William. The text refers to certain regalia, including, it would appear, the actual sword with which Hund was initiated. Quote, "Observe that the blade and other articles are now in your charge. The Earl was not able to take them. Mr. Grills and I think your care the best. Poor old Kilmarnock, God bless him, received the blade from Alexander Seton, the Knight of the Red Feather. I know not what will happen now. God willing, you and Gardner will continue 100 years. Remember, Kay, next month on the 18th. Kilmarnock." End quote. If this letter can be believed, and there is certainly no reason whatever to doubt its authenticity, the writer knew the Knight of the Red Feather to be one Alexander Seton. Alexander Seton was more generally known as Alexander Montgomery, 10th Earl of Eglinton. In 1600, Robert Seton was created 1st Earl of Winton. He had married Lady Margaret Montgomery, daughter and heiress of Hugh Montgomery, 3rd Earl of Eglinton, and the Eglinton title was inherited by the younger of their sons, his descendants assuming the surname of Montgomery. Thus the Alexander Seton in question was in fact Alexander Montgomery, who was particularly active in Jacobite Freemasonry on the continent. When Chevalier Ramsay died in 1743, for example, his death certificate was signed by Alexander Montgomery, Earl of Eglinton, Charles Radcliffe, Earl of Derwentwater, Michael de Ramsay, the Chevalier's cousin, Alexander Home, and George de Leslie. Why should it have been Alexander Montgomery / Seton rather than Radcliffe, Ramsay, Kilmarnock, Charles Edward Stuart, or anyone else who dubbed Baron von Hund a Knight of the Temple? Undoubtedly because he was descended from the family around whom, in the person of the elusive David Seton, the original survivors of the Templars in Scotland had rallied when their patrimonial lands were illicitly disposed of by Sir James Sandilands in 1564, and if the information we received from a contemporary member of the family is accurate, an order of the Temple has persisted among the Montgomerys to the present day. In the aftermath of the 1745 rebellion, Jacobite Freemasonry as such, with its specific political orientation and allegiance to the Stuart bloodline, effectively died out. Variations of it, however, purged of political content and tempered by the moderation of the Grand Lodge of England, survived. They survived in part through the so-called higher degrees offered by such institutions as Irish Grand Lodge. Most important, however, they survived within the strict observance promulgated by Hund, of which the highest degree was that of Knight Templar. The strict observance was to spread throughout Europe. More significant still, however, it was to find fertile soil among the colonists, many of them Jacobite refugees or deportees, of what was to become the United States. And that's the end of that chapter. And that takes us into Section 4, Freemasonry and American Independence. Which is Chapter 15, The First American Freemasons. I'm doing pretty good, so I'm going to just go ahead and jump right into it. This one's a little bit longer. That one was only like 6 pages. This one's like 8 pages, and there's a map. Okay, not surprisingly, perhaps there is more myth, legend, and rumor associated with the origins of Freemasonry in America than there is hard fact or reliable information. According to some traditions, a form of Freemasonry or Proto-Freemasonry came to the New World as early as the Jamestown settlement in 1607 and established itself in Virginia, working to promote the kind of idealized society outlined 20 years later by Francis Bacon in such works as The New Atlantis. This possibility cannot entirely be discounted. The Rosicrucian thinkers of the early 17th century were obsessively aware of the opportunities America offered for the idealized social blueprints that figured so prominently in their work. So, too, were the members of the Invisible College, which eventually became visible in the form of the Royal Society. It would be most surprising if at least something of their ideas did not find its way across the Atlantic. In any case, the first transplantations of Freemasonry to America, when and wherever they occurred, would have been as inevitable, as routine, as predictable, and initially as devoid of major consequence as the transplantation of other English attitudes and institutions. No one could have foreseen the significance of these transplantations would quickly assume. So far as authoritative documentation is concerned, the first known Freemason to settle in the American colonies was one John Skene. Skene is listed as a Mason of an Aberdeen lodge in 1670, and in 1682 emigrated to North America. He settled in New Jersey, where he later became deputy governor, but the Freemasonry he brought with him would have existed in a vacuum in New Jersey. There were no brethren with whom Skene might have consorted, no existing Freemasonic framework into which he might have fitted. Nor did he create any of his own. No record, at any rate, survives to suggest otherwise. Skene had become a Freemason before ever going to America. The first American-based settler to become a Freemason was Jonathan Belcher, who, on a visit to England in 1704, was initiated into an English lodge. Belcher returned to the colonies a year later, becoming in time a prosperous merchant and eventually, in 1730, governor of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. By that time, Freemasonry was starting to establish itself solidly in the colonies, and Belcher's son was to become particularly active in its dissemination. There must have been many cases similar to those of Skene and Belcher, men who were already Freemasons when they emigrated to the colonies. Men already settled in the colonies who, on visits to England, were inducted into lodges, and in 1719 there is even a record of a ship called the Freemason plying the American coastal trade. But there is no record whatever of any American-based lodges prior to the late 1720s. On 8 December 1730, Benjamin Franklin printed in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, the first documented notice about Freemasonry in North America. Franklin's article, which consisted of a general account of Freemasonry, was prefaced by the statement that there are several lodges of Freemasons erected in this province. Quote unquote. Franklin himself became a Freemason in February 1731 and Provincial Grand Master of Pennsylvania in 1734. That same year he ushered into print the first Freemasonic book to be published in America, an edition of Anderson's Constitutions. In the meantime, the first recorded American lodge had been founded in Philadelphia. Its earliest surviving documents, labeled as its second book of records, date from 1731. So that the first book, assuming there was one, must have covered at least the previous year. Many of the earliest lodges in America, including very possibly some whose records have not survived, and which we therefore have no means of knowing about, were, in Freemasonry's own language, irregular. In order to become regular or regularized, a lodge had to be warranted, had to receive a charter, that is, from a superior governing body, a Grand Lodge or, so to speak, Mother Lodge. Thus, for example, the Grand Lodge of England would issue warrants to its own offshoots, or new lodges. In the American colonies, but warrants could only be issued by other bodies such as Grand Lodge of Ireland, which offered the so-called higher degrees and other features characteristic of Jacobite Freemasonry, which had been divested after 1745 of its specifically pro-Stuart orientation, yet retained its uniquely chivalric quality. The first officially warranted or chartered lodge on record in America is St. John's Lodge of Boston, founded in 1733 and chartered by the Grand Lodge of England. In the same year, as we have seen, Grand Lodge was also raising money to send to its brethren in Oglethorpe's colony of Georgia, although no records of specific lodges, warranted or unwarranted, survive prior to 1735, when one was established in Savannah. In the meantime, Massachusetts in 1733 had already warranted a provincial Grand Lodge under the Grand Mastership of Henry Price. The Deputy Grand Master was Andrew Belcher, son of Jonathan Belcher, who had been initiated in England in 1704. Between 1733 and 1737, the Grand Lodge of England warranted principal Grand Lodges in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. In Georgia, New Hampshire, and other future states, there were one or more local lodges, but no provincial Grand Lodge. From Virginia, no records survive, but there are supposed to have been lodges warranted not by the Grand Lodge of England, but by the quasi-Jacobite Grand Lodge of York. Military lodges. At the same time that Freemasonry, almost entirely under the auspices of the Grand Lodge of England, was spreading through the colonies, there occurred another development which was to have a much more profound effect on American history. Since 1732, Freemasonry had been spreading through the British Army in the form of regimental field lodges. These lodges were mobile, carrying their regalia and accoutrements in trunks along with the regimental colors, silver, and other purely military paraphernalia. Often, the colonel commanding would preside as the lodge's original master, and might then be succeeded by other officers. The regimental field lodges were to have a profound effect on the army as a whole. They provided, as we shall see, a channel of communication for the redress of grievances, and just as civilian lodges brought together men of diverse backgrounds and social classes, so the field lodges brought together officers and men, subalterns, and more senior commanders. One consequence of this was the creation of a climate in which dynamic young soldiers, such as James Wolfe, for example, could advance themselves regardless of caste. The first lodge in the British Army was created in the 1st Foot, later the Royal Scots, in 1732. By 1734, there were 5 such regimental lodges. By 1755, there were 29. Among the regiments possessing their own field lodges were those later to be known as the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the Royal Scots Fusiliers, the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, the Gloucestershire Regiment, the Dorset Regiment, the Border Regiment, and the Duke of Wellington's West Riding. Of particular significance is the fact that these lodges were not chartered by the Grand Lodge of England. On the contrary, they were chartered by Irish Grand Lodge, which offered the higher degrees, characteristic of Jacobite Freemasonry. Moreover, these lodges were chartered prior to 1745, when the higher degrees first began to be purged of their Jacobite orientation. At the same time, of course, Freemasonry had also established itself in the upper echelons of military command and administration, and included some of the most prominent figures of the day. The Duke of Cumberland, for example, younger son of George II, was a Freemason. So too, it seemed, was General Sir John Ligonier, the most important British military commander of the 1740s. During the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, Ligonier commanded the British Army in the Midlands. A year later, he was transferred to the continent, where he played a key role in operations during the War of the Austrian Succession. Ligonier's precise Freemasonic affiliations have not been definitively established, but he appears as early as 1732 on the lists of subscribers to James Anderson's work, along with such prominent Freemasons as de Saguier, the Earl of Abercorn, and the Earl of Dalkeith, all 3 former Grand Masters of Grand Lodge. Among Ligonier's subordinates was the man who would emerge as perhaps the single most important British commander of the age, and future Lord Geoffrey Amherst, who will figure conspicuously in this narrative. Amherst was commissioned in the 1st Foot Guards, now the Grenadier Guards, under Ligonier, whose aide-de-camp he became. Before going on to greater things in America, he served with Ligonier on the continent during the War of the Austrian Succession. In 1756, he became lieutenant colonel of the 15th Foot, later the East Yorkshire Regiment, where the field lodge, established 2 years before, continued to function under his auspices. Subsequently, he was to become colonel of the 3rd Foot, the Buffs or East Kent Regiment, and the 60th Foot, known then as the Royal Americans, later as the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and now as the Royal Green Jackets. In both units, field lodges were established under his aegis. We're almost to the... Whoa. Okay. Yeah, this one's quite a bit longer. But, no big deal. Amherst's sponsor, the man who paid for his commission, had been a family friend, Lionel Sackville, 1st Duke of Dorset, an associate of the Duke of Wharton, together with whom he became a Knight of the Garter in 1741. Sackville had 2 sons. The elder Charles, Earl of Middlesex, founded a Freemasonic lodge in Florence in 1733. Along with Sir Francis Dashwood, he also co-founded the Dilettanti Society, which had many Masonic members. By 1751, both he and Dashwood were members of a prominent entourage of Freemasons attached to the court of Frederick, Prince of Wales, who was himself a Freemason. Sackville's younger son, George, was equally active in Freemasonic affairs. By 1746, he was colonel of the 20th Foot, later the Lancashire Fusiliers, and took a particular interest in the regiment's field lodge, even becoming its official master. One of his two wardens was Lieutenant Colonel Edward Cornwallis, twin brother of the later Archbishop of Canterbury, who in 1750 was made governor of Nova Scotia and founded the first lodge there. Among Cornwallis's superintendents was the young Captain James Wolfe, who had already established a reputation for brilliance and audacity under the Duke of Cumberland, then under Sir John Ligonier on the continent. Subsequently, of course, working in close concert with Amherst, Wolfe was to play a decisive role in the course of North American history. And Cornwallis sounds really familiar, too, from the Revolutionary War. I wonder if he'll be coming up here again soon. George Sackville himself, in the meantime, had become, by 1751, Grand Master of Irish Grand Lodge. 8 years later, during the 7 Years' War, he was to be charged with cowardice at the Battle of Minden, court-martialed and dismissed from the service. His friendship with George III, however, enabled him to retain his status in governmental quarters. By 1775, under the title of Lord Germain, he was a colonel secretary. It was in this capacity that he served through the American War for Independence. The French and Indian War. Events were soon to bring American Freemasonry and that of the British Army together on a hitherto unprecedented scale. Substantial contingents of British regulars, both officers and men, were soon to be working in close concert with the colonists, training them in military procedures and operations, and in the process transmitting other things as well, not least the corpus of higher degree, formerly Jacobite Freemasonry. And this Freemasonry was to provide an ideal conduit for the kind of rapport and sense of fraternity that tends generally to develop among comrades in arms. Okay, I'm going to pause there. And this is a map, and it says the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1760. The writing is pretty small, so I'm going to get it as close as I can to the camera so you can try to read it. And I'll have to scan up. Okay. Northern limit of the colonies, Nova Scotia, Quebec, surrendered 1759. Montreal surrendered September 1760. Crown Point surrendered May 1759. Fort Ticonderoga surrendered May 1759. Fort Frontenac surrendered July 1758. There's Boston, Albany, New York, Philadelphia. Fort Duchesne surrendered November 1758, renamed Fort Pitt, today Pittsburgh. And, yeah. Savannah, Proclamation Line, Treaty of Paris. So there you go. We'll come out so you can get kind of an overall of it. All right. There had, of course, been military operations in America before where British and French interests had been clashing since the beginning of the 18th century. During the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701 to 14, a joint French and Spanish attack on Charleston in South Carolina was successfully repulsed. Small-scale skirmishing between British and French colonists also occurred around the Canadian border. The French territory called Acadia being captured and rechristened Nova Scotia. A quarter of a century later, during the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, there was again operations in America, this time on a slightly larger scale. In 1745, colonists from New England seized the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence. Again, however, operations in North America were peripheral, mere footnotes to the more important campaigns being conducted in Europe. They involved extremely small numbers of regular troops, relatively junior officers, and were little more than skirmishes. In 1756, however, the 7 Years' War erupted in Europe, and this time large-scale military and naval operations spread much further afield, extending indeed not only as far as America, but to India as well. British troops were once again to be engaged in campaigns on the continent, but in relatively modest numbers compared to the forces of France, Austria, and Prussia. The British Army's principal theater of activity was to be North America, and the rivers and forests of the New World were to witness clashes between sizable, highly trained, and well-drilled European armies on a scale that would have seemed inconceivable half a century before. Between 1745 and 1753, the English population of North America had swollen dramatically, and not just with exiled or refugee Jacobites. As early as 1754, Benjamin Franklin proposed a plan for the union of all the colonies, which the British government rejected. But if political centralization was denied, organization, communication, and trade developed rapidly, and need for expansion westward became increasingly pressing. When colonists from Virginia began moving into the Ohio Valley of western Pennsylvania, however, they threatened the link between French territory and Canada on the St. Lawrence and that on the Mississippi, and when a contingent of colonial militia under the young George Washington was dispatched into the region to build a fort, full-scale fighting broke out. The first 4 years of the war were marred by military disasters, some of them serious enough to send shock waves reverberating back to England. In April 1755, a British column, both regulars and colonial militia, under General Edward Braddock, was ambushed by French troops and their Indian allies near Fort Duquesne. The column was virtually annihilated. Braddock was fatally wounded, and Washington, his aide-de-camp, was barely escaped. A sequence of additional reverses ensued, one after another. British forts throughout what is now upstate New York were lost, and a massive European-style general assault intended to recapture Fort Ticonderoga was repulsed with appalling casualties. Among them was the commander himself, General James Abercrombie, and Lord George Howe, one of the most promising young officers in the British Army at the time. Prior to his death, Howe had been one of the leading innovators into the kind of irregular warfare that was coming to characterize operations in North America. Along with Amherst and Wolfe, he was instrumental in helping the Army adapt itself from the rigid maneuvers of the European battlefield to the more flexible, more modern tactics dictated by the rivers and forests of the wilderness in which it now had to fight. According to a prominent military historian, quote, Howe threw off all training and prejudices of the barrack yard, joined the irregulars in their scouting parties, and adopted the dress of his rough companions, and became one of themselves. Having thus schooled himself, he began to impart the lessons he had learned. He made officers and men alike throw off all useless encumbrances. He cut the skirts off their coats and the hair off their heads, browned the barrels of their muskets, clad their lower limbs in leggings to protect them from briars, and filled the empty spaces of their knapsacks with 30 pounds of meal, so as to make them independent for weeks. End quote, Howe's death at Ticonderoga deprived the British Army of one of its most resourceful, imaginative, and audacious figures, a man who displayed the potential of a great commander. But Ticonderoga was to be the last serious British reverse of the war. In England, William Pitt, later Earl of Chatham, had become Secretary of State and embarked on a massive reshuffle of both the Army and the Royal Navy. Old-fashioned, hidebound, and doctrinaire officers were sacked, demoted, or passed over, and the commands were handed out to a host of young, more dynamic, more flexible, and more innovative men. In North America, the most important of these were James Wolfe, then aged 31, and Amherst, 10 years older, who, on the advice of his old superior, Sir John Ligonier, was appointed Major General and Commander-in-Chief. Among Wolfe's and Amherst's most prominent subordinates were Thomas de Saguiers, son of the distinguished Freemason, and William Howe, younger brother of George, and later a central figure in the American War for Independence. As Commander-in-Chief, Amherst was better placed than Lord George Howe had been to introduce new techniques and tactics to the Army. He adopted Howe's innovations and created a number of others as well. Rifle or sharpshooter regiments clad in dark green ranger units for scouting and guerrilla operations, light infantry. One light infantry regiment designed significantly for scouting and skirmishing, was clad in dark brown skirtless coats with no lace or adornment of any kind. Some troops were even dressed in Indian apparel. A number of colonial officers learned their trade from Amherst, officers who would later rise to prominence during the American War for Independence. It was from Amherst that such men as Charles Lee, Israel Putnam, Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and Philip John Schuyler acquired both the discipline of the professional soldier and the tactics specifically adapted to warfare in North America. And while Washington had by then resigned his commission, he too knew and was profoundly influenced by Amherst. In July 1758, Amherst and his entourage of gifted young subordinates recaptured Louisburg, taken initially during the War of the Austrian Succession, then lost. 3.5 months later, another British column captured Fort Duchesne, razed it to the ground, and rebuilt it as Fort Pitt, the site now of Pittsburgh. During the following year, Amherst advanced through upstate New York, capturing one fort after another, including Ticonderoga. In September 1759, Wolfe, with William Howe leading the advance column, accomplished one of the most audacious feats in military history, proceeding up the St. Lawrence by ship, then scaling the sheer cliffs of the Heights of Abraham outside the citadel of Quebec with 4,000 troops. In the battle that ensued, both Wolfe and the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, died, but the tide had now turned. Desultory operations continued for another year. Then in September 1760, Montreal, besieged by Amherst and William Howe, capitulated, and France ceded her North American colonies to Britain. Whew. I can tell I'm getting tired. I start stumbling a lot more. The influx of British regulars into North America brought with it an influx of Freemasonry, particularly the kind of higher degree Freemasonry warranted by Irish Grand Lodge. Of the 19 line regiments under Amherst's command, no fewer than 13 had practicing field lodges. Lieutenant Colonel John Young, who commanded a battalion of the 60th Foot, one of the regiments under Amherst's personal colonelcy, at both Louisburg and Quebec, had as early as 1736 been appointed Deputy Grand Master of Grand Lodge of Scotland by Sir William St. Clair of Roslin. In 1757 he had become provincial Grand Master for all Scottish lodges in America and the West Indies. In 1761 Young was succeeded in the 60th foot by Lieutenant Colonel, subsequently Major General, Augustine Prevost. In the same year Prevost became Grand Master of all lodges in the British Army, warranted by another Freemasonic body, the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. In 1756, one Colonel Richard Gridley was authorized to congregate all free and accepted Masons in the expedition against Crown Point, subsequently taken by Amherst, and form them into one or more lodges. When Louisburg fell in 1758, Gridley formed another lodge there. In November 1759, 2 months after Wolfe's capture of Quebec, the 6 field lodges of the troops occupying the citadel convened a meeting. It was decided that since there were so many lodges in the Quebec garrison, they should form themselves into a Grand Lodge and elect a Grand Master. Accordingly, Lieutenant John Gwinnett of the 47th Foot, later the Lancashire Regiment, was elected Grand Master of the province of Quebec. He was succeeded a year later by Colonel Simon Fraser, commander of the 78th Foot, the Fraser Highlanders. Fraser, significantly enough, was the son of Lord Lovat, who, as a prominent Jacobite, had taken a major part in the 1745 rebellion and acquired the dubious distinction of being the last man ever executed on Tower Hill. In 1761, Simon Fraser was succeeded as Quebec's provincial Grand Master by Thomas Span of the 47th Foot. Span was followed in 1762 by Captain Milborne West of the same regiment, and West in 1764 became provincial Grand Master for the whole of Canada. One of the most interesting aspects of all this is the comparatively junior rank, quotidian background, and general obscurity of the men holding such exalted offices. Many of them were not aristocrats, never rose to positions of public prominence, never even advanced themselves significantly or conspicuously in the army. They were basically ordinary soldiers. From the appointments of the likes of Lieutenant Gwinnett and Captain West, one can discover something of the way in which the regimental field lodges functioned, how they pervaded the entire military chain of command, and why they enjoyed such popularity. A subaltern like Lieutenant Gwinnett would have been in daily contact with the rank and file, who, within the framework of the lodge, could deal with him as an equal. At the same time, as provincial Grand Master of Quebec, he would have presided over officers, who in the military hierarchy were far superior. The field lodges thus created a fluidity of interaction and communication which, in the context of the time, was an extraordinary and probably unique social phenomenon. Not surprisingly, the Freemasonry so prevalent in Amherst's army was transmitted to the colonial officers and units serving with it. American commanders and personnel pounced on whatever opportunities arose to become not just comrades in arms, but also fellow Freemasons. Fraternal bonds were thus forged between regular British troops and their colonial colleagues. Lodges proliferated. Freemasonic ranks and titles were conferred like medals or like promotions. Men such as Israel Putnam, Benedict Arnold, Joseph Fry, Hugh Mercer, John Nixon, David Wooster, and of course Washington himself, not only won their military spurs, they were also, if they were not already brethren, inducted into Freemasonry. And even those who did not themselves become practicing Freemasons were still constantly exposed to the influence of Freemasonry, which spilled over from the British Army to merge with the fledgling lodges already established in the colonies. By this means, Freemasonry would come to suffuse the whole of colonial administration, society, and culture. Okay. But it is not just Freemasonry in itself, not just the rites, rituals, traditions, opportunities, and benefits of Freemasonry. It was also an ambiance, a mentality, a hierarchy of attitudes and values for which Freemasonry provided a particularly efficacious conduit. The Freemasonry of the age was a repository for an imaginatively stirring and potent idealism, which it was able in a fashion uniquely its own to disseminate. Most colonists did not actually read Locke, Hume, Voltaire, Diderot, or Rousseau any more than most British soldiers did. Through the lodges, however, the currents of thought associated with such philosophers became universally accessible. It was largely through the lodges that ordinary colonists learned of that lofty premise called the rights of man. It was through the lodges that they learned the concept of the perfectibility of society, and the New World seemed to offer a species of blank slate, a species of laboratory in which social experiment was possible, and the principles enshrined by Freemasonry could be applied in practice. And that is the end of the chapter. So that's plenty for this time. That takes us to chapter 16. So, I'm thinking, let's see how long 16 and 17 are. Okay, 8 pages, 7 pages for 16. 17 is about 8 pages. So, yeah, that's pretty good. We'll read 16 and 17 next time, and then we'll finish up the book. It may be a fairly long reading session. I may have to take a break in the middle of it. But, yeah, about 2 more reading sessions we'll be done with this book. And then we'll jump into 1984. So, and I'm really looking forward to reading that. I actually have never read it. So, other than just little snippets here and there I've run across. So, that should be an interesting read. All right. So, that'll be that for now. I'm going to take a break, end this session, and then I will come back and play some Hogwarts Legacy. I will see you all in a little bit.